Good morning or afternoon. White 1 Advanced U.S. History. We're looking at Module 4 and the new immigrants. Before we go on to Module 5 and progressivism, which is a reaction to the abuses that occurred in the Gilded Age. Gilding over rotten wood or pot metal with gold leaf to make it look valuable, but if you puncture that thin layer underneath, you find the rot and the corruption in this particular case. So Gilded Age is a metaphor. Mark Twain came up with that. It's all covered in gold until you just pierce the surface and you find either the rotten wood or the pot metal that are worthless. That's the corruption that underlay the vast fortunes that were made during this period. One of the motivating forces at this time is the mass of immigrants that are coming to this country. And they're coming into the country, primarily Ellis Island and New York City, the gateways to this country. And the Statue of Liberty is given to us by the French in 1876. Allowing all these huddled masses to breathe free. They're pouring into the cities, and at this time, the use of Bessemer steel allows tall buildings to be built and the concentration of people in cities to become ever greater. At the same time, there's no real sanitation. The city manager has not become a common feature. Well-designed cities are not common at this point, so people are pouring in. And without any proper sanitation, there are all kinds of diseases such as cholera and typhus and typhoid fever that cruise through the populations. As the immigrants come into this country, they are, of course, eager to find work and to find employment. In some cases, even as bad as it was in the cities, it was better than the places from which they came. And so they become victims of exploitation. And one of the main ones that you read about in this section was, of course, William Boss Tweed. And William Tweed is not the only political boss, but he is a very powerful one. I just wanted to read you a little bit from his biography, Boss Tweed. This is at the very beginning. He happens to be in prison, but it describes what he controlled before he was finally put in prison. Tweed had walked the streets of New York City, his lifelong home, as a free man. A year before going to jail, Tweed had stood at the height of power and could laugh at bureaucrats who begged him for favors like everyone else. He, William Maguire Tweed, had been the single most influential man in New York City and a rising force on the national stage. Physically imposing, mentally sharp, Tweed reigned supreme. He was more than simply boss of Tammany Hall, commissioner of public works, and state senator. Tweed controlled judges, mayors, governors, newspapers. He flaunted his wealth, conspicuous and garish beyond anything supportable by his government salaries or even traditional honest graft, as practiced by generations of politicians before and since. Tweed was the third largest landowner in the city, director of the Erie Railway, the 10th National Bank, and the New York Printing Company, proprietor of the Metropolitan Hotel and president of the Americas Club. He owned 2 yachts, a Fifth Avenue mansion, an estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, and a shirt front diamond pin valued at over $15,000, $300,000 in today's money. So he had become extremely wealthy. And as a result, he was able to flaunt the law and really be above it. He could pass out jobs to people and tell them how to vote. This was a practice, this spoils system was a practice that had begun under Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson began to hand out jobs to his friends. And this system of patronage then became so corrupt that finally there were people who were refused jobs, and as a result, James A. Garfield, a president, was assassinated by someone who had been refused a job. And so this is what led to the Pendleton Act in 1883. And the Pendleton Act, I just want to read you a little bit about that, attempted to cut back on all of this graft and these jobs that were given out to immigrants who would vote as they were instructed so that they could keep their jobs. And this Pendleton Act was passed because of the assassination of James A. Garfield, who was killed by an assassin who was upset that he hadn't gotten a particular spoils system job. First, open competitive examinations for testing the fitness of applicants for the public service, now classified or to be classified here. Such examinations shall be practical in their character, and so far as may be, shall relate to those matters which will fairly test the relative capacity and fitness of the persons examined to discharge the duties of the service into which they seek to be appointed. In other words, if you go to City Hall and you want to be, I don't know, IT specialist for the city, you have to actually demonstrate on a competitive exam that you have the knowledge and the skill set to complete that job. It can't simply be handed to you because you're a relative of someone in the government. Second, all the offices, places, and employments so arranged or to be arranged in classes shall be filled by selections according to grade from among those graded highest as the results of such competitive examinations. So it's a merit-based distribution of jobs. And of course, many jobs do not fall under this. The president's cabinet, for example, he or she gets to choose whom he or she wants to work for him. Those are jobs that are still part of the spoils system, if you will. But most government jobs these days fall under the Pendleton Act or Civil Service Commission. Sixth, no person in said service has any right to use his official authority or influence to coerce the political action of any person or body. In other words, you cannot say, well, you better vote Republican or you better vote Democratic this coming election, because if you don't, you just might find yourself out of a job. You cannot use your position to coerce someone else, nor can you use it to extract political contributions. You cannot cheat on the exams. For example, any person who shall willfully, corruptly, or falsely mark, grade, estimate, or report upon the examination or proper standing of any person examined thereunder, or aid in so doing, or who shall willfully and corruptly make any false representations. In other words, you can't have your examination doctored after you take it. And there's a specific paragraph protecting against, well, as best they can, against the cheating in these exams. No officer, clerk, or other person in the service of the United States shall, directly or indirectly, give or hand over to any other officer, clerk, or person in the service of the United States or to any senator any money or other valuable thing on account of or to be applied to the promotion of any political object whatever. So, because the system of Distributing government jobs had gotten so twisted and bent out of shape. And after the assassination of James A. Garfield in early 1880s, finally, Congress reacts and passes this Pendleton Act to guarantee that most federal jobs are based on skill set and competence. At this time, in response to the prosperity gospel and the gospel of wealth, what springs up, of course, is a social gospel, that there is a spiritual requirement, that we begin to aid those less fortunate than we. And that social gospel is represented by Jane Addams, who eventually wins the Nobel Peace Prize for her work. And she establishes houses, settlement houses, if you will, halfway houses for the immigrants and the poor in the cities to begin to find their footing, to learn a skill, to have a place to stay temporarily, and to begin to enter society rather than simply arrive on the shores of this country penniless and then subject to the whims of those who would exploit them. And so the social gospel dovetails nicely with what will become the Granger and then the populist and the progressive movement. And these improvements in society are given a great boost by a Danish sociologist, photographer named Jacob Riis, R-I-I-S. And Jacob Riis is important because he documents in a book how the other half lives. And it describes the terrible conditions and the ravages of alcohol and the tenement living that many people are engaged in that tends to weaken the immigrant population. And Riis is important because none other than Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt is an up-and-coming upstate blue stocking Republican politician who first is commissioner of the Civil Service Commission, which stems from the Pendleton Act. And then he is also, before he becomes vice president and assistant secretary of the Navy, commissioner of police of New York City. He's also later on governor of New York, so he has many political positions. But as commissioner of the New York City Police Department, he goes along on nighttime walks with Jacob Riis, the author of How the Other Half Lives. And Roosevelt, who himself suffered from asthma and had started out as a very frail young man, witnesses firsthand the difficulties of the immigrants and how they are, excuse me, that was a phone call, won't take it, how they are abused in the inner cities. And so as Roosevelt sees this and begins to feel or empathize with these people, he also has to work for his own political survival. He's somewhat of a headstrong young man, and he immediately tends to fall out with the mainstream Republican pals or politicians. And so their goal is to sideline Roosevelt. Roosevelt comes up with a progressive plan to get a bunch of votes from the immigrant population, and it's called the Square Deal. And many of the reforms that are suggested in the progressive platform of James B. Weaver, who runs for president, and beginning with the Grangers and the social gospel and the populists, Roosevelt creates this platform called the Square Deal. And based on the Square Deal, then he does win election in his own right in 1904. So Jacob Riis plays a very important role in the progressive movement and in influencing an influential politician, giving us then a social safety net in the Square Deal, many of the reforms of which we eventually get to in his fifth cousin's New Deal program, and eventually, as a prime example, Romney Care, or what came to be known as Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act. That can be traced all the way back to the progressive platform of Teddy Roosevelt. He proposed some generalized health care. It would cut down on the advance of diseases. If you can nip some of these things, such as cholera outbreaks, in the bud, or tetanus or typhoid, if you can find it early, you can usually stop it. And so Teddy Roosevelt, as a progressive politician, takes up many of these problems that he sees when Jacob Riis is showing him around really the lower nether regions of New York City.